Welcome to video number 3A in the America 2 video series. Video 3 has been divided into 6 short videos, each one about 20 to 35 minutes long, covering between 4 and 7 of the 27 symptoms of societal decline that excess population creates and or makes worse. My name is John Shar, and I will once again be your host for this 6-part video presentation on how we can make America all it can be. This 6-part video will be centered on a discussion of just one of the 8 most significant problems facing our country today: excess population growth, and how it negatively affects some 27 symptoms of societal decline that presently are harming 160 plus million citizens in our country today and every day. Humans have a unique combination of 3 physical and mental characteristics that few, if any, other beings on our planet have. 1, free will. 2, reason. 3, opposable thumbs. It would seem that a combination like that should allow us to recognize and solve problems like no other creatures on our planet, even problems that required removing physical obstacles that were impeding our progress. These are great gifts indeed. And like most gifts, can be used for good, evil, or not at all. We can always elect to abandon reason, just twiddle our opposable thumbs, and using our free will choose to do nothing and just let our problems overwhelm us. But that would seem to be a poor use of such great gifts. So instead, let's consider the problem of excess population together and look at how we can start to bring some natural laws, including the law of supply and demand and the law of cause and effect, back into balance, at least for America. First, a formal reminder of the problem we'll be considering throughout all 6 separate segments comprising this video: unsustainable population growth worldwide and overpopulation-related problems in some countries spilling over to become overpopulation-related problems in other countries, and how this problem is directly connected to each of 27 symptoms of a society, ours, in decline, and what we might be able to do in terms of solving the problem going forward in a way that keeps the problem from coming back to bite us over and over again in the future, as it is doing right now, and how it has been doing for most of the past century. But first, we need to be sure we're all on the same page regarding what exactly constitutes excess population, or overpopulation if you prefer, and refresh our memories with a brief recap of how some societies have dealt with the problem badly in the past so that we don't repeat the same mistakes going forward. Overpopulation is a condition in any society that results from there being more people needing sustenance than there are sources of sustenance available, mostly locally, to sustain the population in question. Minimum requirements for human sustenance are potable water, food, breathable air, a climate that will support life year-round, clothing suitable to the climate, shelter from the elements, medical supplies and treatment facilities for people who become ill, a reliable means of transport to and from work, shopping, other travel as necessary, educational availability of some kind, reliable energy sources for travel, homes and businesses, protection of citizens and their properties from criminal elements, and last, but certainly not least, adequate numbers of meaningful paying jobs that allow these basic requirements for sustenance to exist and be met for all the citizens of the society. There are zillions of square miles of uninhabited space on our planet. Given the tendency of humans to explore and populate places other than where they are at the time, it might seem surprising that, given the ever-expanding population, these places would not by now have been settled. But in the great majority, they remain unsettled and mostly lacking any presence at all, human presence. And there's good reason for that. These places are, for the most part, inhospitable to settlement by large and sometimes even small groups of people. They lack the minimum requirements for sustaining a human population long term. When we consider the areas on our planet, including in our own country, that are unsuitable for human occupancy, from lakes, oceans, areas that are desert, areas that are steep mountains, areas that haven't enough groundwater irrigation that can be made available, to swamps and jungles, areas that are frequently or continually flooded, areas so windy the topsoil's all been blown away and can't sustain crop growth, volcanic areas, badland areas, deep canyon areas, areas whose soils won't support either crops or animals year-round because of their mineral content. They're too acidic or alkaline. Areas that were once under an ocean, whose soils are now too salty for agriculture. The areas covered with nothing but rock and boulders, and areas that can't be cleared because we have an ongoing need for the things that grow there, like trees, for use in making the things we still need for our sustenance, and areas that can only be reached by helicopter or boats that won't allow or be able to sustain an infrastructure suitable to a population needing to be able to get to and from work and back each day. The total area available for human occupation out of the zillions of square miles of ocean and terrain overall shrinks to less than 3% of the overall total. And we have already settled all but a very few of those areas. I'll talk a bit about carrying capacities. We live in a finite world. Planet Earth has a carrying capacity in humans, just like a fenced-off pasture has a finite carrying capacity for cows. In the pasture example, when the carrying capacity of the pasture is exceeded, the population of cows begin to experience starvation, disease, and ultimately death for the entire cattle population. It isn't the case that the strongest cows survive and the rest perish. The entire population of cows dies off when all the food and water are used up and disease takes over. The carrying capacity of planet Earth in humans is very close to being reached, if it hasn't been reached or exceeded already. We see, but mostly ignore, evidence of this every day, wherever we travel and wherever we look. Global warming due to pollution attacking the protective ozone layer that allows our planet to sustain life of any kind, lack of sufficient water to support both human and crop growth in some, actually many areas all over the planet, attempting to move things like oil to where it's pumped out of the ground to where it could be processed and distributed, sometimes thousands or tens of thousands of miles, with occasional pipeline or wellhead fractures or shipwrecks, truck wrecks, train wrecks that result in poisoning the groundwater supply and ruining the topsoil for agriculture. And in those instances, where it's being pumped from below the surface of the oceans to despoil the sea, its creatures, and the coral reefs that constitute the beginning food chain element for all the sea's larger creatures, and spills that soil beaches all over the world with its residue, tragic mass starvations of people in some countries, sicknesses and plagues that now spread worldwide, used to be contained locally or regionally. mass destruction of some rainforests that, when gone, will result in there being inadequate oxygen for humans to breathe. Oceans being polluted with zillions of tons of non-biodegradable plastic each year, and people driven to madness because their governments seem incapable of making things better. And they don't see any way out of a downward spiral that will claim them and their families, so they just start shooting. An example that directly affects America would be both Saudi Arabia and China have for several years been purchasing water and acreage in America and elsewhere to grow crops that they then ship back to their countries because they have already exceeded the carrying capacity in humans in their countries and are now attempting to delay the inevitable by finding remote sources outside of Saudi Arabia and China to keep them going a while longer. But this is not a sustainable long-range option for Saudi Arabia and or China. At some point in the not-too-distant future, America's government will be forced by America's citizens to stop this practice and take back these resources for America's use alone, so as to be able to continue taking care of America's own expanding population. And when that happens, China and Saudi Arabia will see the long-term effects of doing nothing to balance the growth in humans with their country's natural, built-in carrying capacities. Typically, this is when countries begin taking sides and forming alliances to protect themselves. And war, again, becomes the preferred way of gaining territory and resources. As was the case in the not-too-distant past in both Nazi Germany and Japan, and is actually going on right now as this is being displayed on your screen in a war between Russia and its neighboring country, Ukraine. We're not alone. Right now, today, there are, at last count, 70 plus other countries around the world stringing chain link fences topped by razor wire across one or more of their borders, mostly, for now, at or near entry points and exit points, to discourage citizens from other, typically but not always, adjoining countries from illegally immigrating into their countries because they don't have the minimum requirements to sustain the new entrants without, at the same time, damaging the citizens already living there. This situation was examined in some detail a couple of years back in a Prime TV documentary entitled Human Flow. If you haven't seen it, you might want to make an attempt to do so. It's depressing, but it does a pretty good job of showing the scope of the problem worldwide. Here in the United States, we've been made acutely aware of the problem mostly by the increasing number of people coming across our southern border with Mexico. The high illegal immigration levels are not a recent phenomenon in the United States. For almost 45 years, immigrants from South America, Central America, and Mexico have been illegally entering America through Mexico at the rate of approximately 230 immigrants per hour, 24 hours a day, every day of the year. That amounts to 5,520 new people a day, or 2,014,800 new people each year. Each year for 45 plus years. Our government avoided even acknowledging the problem for about the first 20 to 30 years, and since then has tried about one new program every 3 to 6 months or so to stem the tide ever since. All to no avail. No avail. Most recently, in 2024, our government has determined to throw in the towel and is proposing to let 5,000 a day enter legally if they'll promise to work to become citizens over the first 3 years after they enter. And if they don't, shame on them. But there really are no downsides or realistic penalties if immigrants don't become citizens after entering, any more than there were downsides or realistic penalties before the new official new 5,000 per day limit was planned for implementation. Note that the planned 5,000 a day official figure our government is now proposing to enter legally is very close to approximation to the 5,520 a day that have been coming in anyway for the past 45 years, while the government was spending untold and often off the books billions of dollars annually trying to keep them out. The cost going forward will possibly be in the trillions of dollars annually, whether the illegals stay in America, go back where they originally came from, or move somewhere else altogether, whether by choice or otherwise. Managing excess population growth. A couple of ways that have been tried that didn't work out all that well, including the most often approach, surrender and declare victory, the government's preferred approach to addressing the negative after effects of illegal immigration on our society, surrender and declare victory, is the same one they adopted during Vietnam, when the Vietnamese were chasing us out of their country after we spent 25 plus years shooting, bombing, gassing, and burning them daily by the thousands in hopes of getting them to do things our way or else. We spent about $500 billion in that failed experience, plus 58,000 plus Americans killed, and another 50,000 plus Americans maimed and wounded. And then we left in a panic, with our tail between our legs, and our government told our citizens we had negotiated a fair and lasting compromise. Bottom line, we got our ass kicked, surrendered, ran for our lives, and then lied about it. And when our troops came home, the great majority found, there were no good jobs waiting for them, as our government had promised there would be. 50 years after the fact, many of our returning Vietnam veterans are now living with PTSD in homeless encampments, guarded areas surrounded by chain-link fences, sometimes topped with razor wire. Outside the cities they were initially occupying on the streets, because the governments of those cities didn't want the visitors to their cities to witness the homelessness, and move the homeless citizens well outside where the visitors would be bothered by their presence and not be continually reminded of their government's failure to address the problem that made them homeless in the first place. And Vietnam was really just a replay of our surrender and declare victory truce that finally got us out of the shooting war in Korea a couple of decades earlier, also while supposedly saving face. And now that we surrendered and declared victory in Korea, we have a fat little Korean toad threatening us with nukes. Some victory. And once our government learned how well that worked in lulling the citizens back into a deep sleep, each time we lost another war, our government used it again and again going forward in wars we decided to involve ourselves in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and others, each of which wars we ultimately lost, but couldn't bring ourselves to admit it. So we surrendered and declared victory. A second popular way of managing excess populations, beginning with World War II when the Nazis initially set out to intern or imprison all Jewish peoples in concentration camps, supposedly to be exported to other countries later, only to find out, soon after the internment program was underway, no other country was willing to take them, and they had no way to feed them, clothe them, house even a significant minority of them, or provide medical treatments for any of them, and decided instead to just kill them in order to alleviate the food, clothing, housing, and medical shortages, supply and demand imbalances that they, the Nazis, created. And going forward from there, every war fought since, one reason for the war was that one side or the other could not provide jobs, food, housing, clothing, medical treatment, and so forth for everyone in the country, and then decided to just find a way to eliminate the surplus population, and at the same time steal the resources they needed in order to bring supply and demand back into some sort of balance temporarily. Stalin used mostly sickness and starvation, but also some bullets, to eliminate upwards of 30 million Russian citizens who inconvenienced him. The Chinese under Mao Zedong also possibly killed about that many during their conversion from oppressive socialism-based communism to capitalism-based freedom-loving communists. And of course, most of us can still remember Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, who killed more than 1 million Cambodian citizens, mostly women and children, in just over a single year. The Nazis decided that the way to go would be to exterminate everyone that was not of Aryan descent, meaning mostly white, non-Jewish people living in Western Europe. The Nazis managed to murder about 7 million, mostly Jewish people, living in internment camps before they were stopped, plus about 20 to 30 million other civilians in a dozen other countries in Europe, Asia, and Africa, mostly women and children, during that war. On the screen now, you can see a mathematical representation of the law of supply and demand. M equals D divided by S times A, where M equals the logical current market price, D is the demand by qualified buyers, S is the total supply available, and A is the asking price based on past history. The law of supply and demand works for everything, from labor costs, costs of homes, automobiles, foodstuffs, commodities of all kinds, and money, interest rates, to services of every kind, as well as projecting optimum levels of just about anything that could be measured, like optimum labor levels, optimum crop levels, water levels in a reservoir, optimum average hourly wage cost for workers, and so on. It works every time. Negating the natural laws of supply and demand Demand requires artificially manipulating, in other words, lying about either D or S, demand and supply. Excess population and its ever-present sidekick, the law of supply and demand, are two of the most significant reasons for ongoing wars on our planet. In each case, when making decisions, experts measure the supply of, for example, the number of people needing good jobs against the number of qualified people there are available to fill those jobs, and so on, for homes, foodstuff, cars to be produced, and so on. Experts then enter the known variables. In some instances, they don't actually know the numbers, so they just put in their best guesses for D for demand, S for supply, and A for what they think the asking price would be, and solve the equation. Government experts routinely use the law of supply and demand to estimate how many new jobs are needed, what a minimum wage should be, and so forth. The tricky part for us citizens is how to check the numbers the government uses when doing these things. It is the case that the law of supply and demand is no more accurate and or reliable than the variable estimates the experts use to get an answer they like. If government, for example, wanted to persuade the citizens that unemployment is running 3.7%, their experts can manipulate the variables to arrive at just that number. And because of this, there are times when the citizens question the validity of the government's numbers, but absent some way to validate the government's beginning numbers for D, demand, S for supply, most citizens accept without any proof whatsoever whatever the numbers are that the government publishes. And the government has been caught red-handed more than once, fudging the numbers to get citizens to go along with their stories about unemployment levels within our overall workforce, or the state of the economy, or inflation levels, or pandemic levels, or progress in a war we chose to get involved in, or something of the kind. I want to give you here an example showing that figures don't lie, but liars do figure. Perhaps a better title might be Misdirections, Half-Truths, and Outright Lies. Assume that the country has 163 million qualified people comprising the workforce, all work disciplines, and represents the S, or supply, in the equation. The rest of the citizens are made up of infants, people too young to work, children enrolled in schools, people too old to work, people retired from working, people who are too sick to work, people who have serious mental or physical disabilities and can't work, citizens who are in mental hospitals or criminal penitentiaries, people not eligible legally to work because they immigrated illegally, people who don't speak, read, or write English well enough to get good jobs, and so on. And also, suppose that the government estimated that based solely on the number of unemployment checks they're mailing out, all but 6 million of the total people needing a good job already had a good, meaningful paying job. The unemployment demand would equal 6 million people and represent the D in the equation. So demand divided by supply, 6 million divided by 163 million would be 3.6 7%, just like the government said. Now, suppose that the actual number of the 163 million that didn't already have a meaningful paying job and needed one was 47 million, which is much closer to the correct number. Now, demand divided by supply, D over S, would be 47 million divided by 163 million, or 28.8%. Wow. The difference between 3.7% and 28.8% is a big difference, 25.1%. How can that be explained? Actually, the explanation is simple. The government excludes two categories of workers by pretending that one of these categories just doesn't exist, and the other category isn't important enough to list in their unemployed calculations, but they keep it around for statistical purposes. Each of the excluded categories is significant in number, too significant to gloss over, and excluding them in their unemployment calculations really renders the government's calculations suspect. I'm displaying on the other side of the screen now a depression unemployment comparison spreadsheet between the depths of the Great Depression in the 30s and 40s and the depression that's going on today. This was compiled in 2010. The first group, which is the second group on the chart, compiled in 2010, that the government ignores are the long-term unemployed workers that lost a good job when the manufacturing company where they worked for 20 to 30 years and helped become rich and powerful fired them at a point in time when they were getting too old to easily find comparable work, especially when most of the other large employers in the same category, manufacturing, were also firing their American workforces and moving their manufacturing operations to another country. The second group on the spreadsheet now represents about 12% of the willing and able workforce that the government refuses to acknowledge. They no longer have jobs. They're still unemployed. They're still looking for meaningful paying work. But they're not counted by the government because they no longer are getting unemployment checks from the government. Their unemployment ran out, so they just don't count anymore. Every year for which unemployment figures have been kept over the past 40 to 50 years' time, approximately 99.65% of the workers that lost their jobs through job migration, downsizing in general, automation, whatever, found another job within a year. But 1/3 of 1% never found another job that paid more than it cost to keep the job. Every year, year after year, like water torture, over a 38-year span of time, that 1/3% a year, each year, compounded into the total of 12% plus that exist today. It isn't talked about much. But there is a cost associated with holding down every job in America. The costs of keeping the job have to be netted out against the take-home pay the worker receives for doing the job. Costs like transportation costs, getting to and from work, car payments, if that's the mode of transportation, loan or lease payments, license fees, insurance, fuel, tires, maintenance, repairs, and so on. Child care, if no one's home to take care of the children, and of course, the federal deductions for income, Social Security and Medicare, and similar related state-imposed taxes. The people in this second group did the math to determine they would be working for between $0 and $2 an hour net and refused to take those kind of jobs. The second group is actually the third group on the chart. You can see it over there. That the government does not acknowledge are the workers whose good jobs, like those in the first example, went away when their manufacturing company abandoned them and moved their manufacturing operations out of the United States, or downsized or merged them out of existence, and in order to get work of any kind, had to accept jobs beneath their skill, education, and experience levels just to stay alive and hopefully, but not always, keep their homes. These people are employed, but typically at a fraction of what they earned before their employer abandoned them, and are also without the benefits they once had. Most of them are no longer working in the manufacturing sector because there isn't much of a manufacturing sector left in America. The third group now represents about 13% of the willing and able workforce that the government treats as if they're meaningfully employed, when in fact they are not really holding down good jobs at all. But it's good enough for the government, because the government still gets to count them statistically as fully employed. These are the ones from Group 1 in the group over there that leapfrog right over Group 2 and landed in Group 3. The workers in Group 3 are often working at 2 and sometimes more low-paying jobs because one low-paying job wouldn't cut it. This is where most of the 99.65% that got a job within a year ended up every year. If just this underemployed group's numbers were to be added to the group's acknowledged unemployed percent, the actual unemployment rate would be 16.7% instead of the 3.7% that the government wants us to accept. And if you add both the 12 and 13% to the government's 3.7%, you would have 28.7%. And now the numbers seem to add up almost perfectly. Then the question becomes, whose numbers do you believe? But that is a topic for another video. This video is about unsustainable population growth and the damaging symptoms of societal decline that spring from it. And beginning with America 2 Video 3B, we're going to start quantifying the damage, symptom by symptom. Thanks for watching and listening. Thanks for caring about our country and wanting to see America and us become all we can be together. Be well.